Hello and welcome to MetaSounds for the Wwise. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to recreate the random continuous container from Wwise in MetaSounds. We're going to be using the random step container we created in the last video as a starting point, so we're not going to go over things like randomizing pitch or volume. Instead, we're going to be focusing mainly on the different transition types. So just to go over them, there's trigger rate, which is the time between the beginning of one audio file and the beginning of the next. There's delay, which is the time between the end of one file and the beginning of the next. There's sample accurate, which is just when one audio file plays directly after the previous without any latency. And there are two different types of crossfades, constant amplitude and constant power. We'll start off with the trigger rate transition type. I've opened up the random step container that we made in the previous video. And just to go over what it does, when we play the MetaSound, it chooses a sound from an array, and then it triggers the unfinished output, which stops the MetaSound. Because we want to make a continuous container, we don't want the unfinished output to trigger after we play the sound. In fact, we want to re-trigger the array of sounds after a certain delay, or trigger rate in this case. To do that, we're going to use a node called the trigger repeat, which triggers an output at a time interval that we set in the period section. If I set it to half a second and then play the MetaSound, you may notice that we have a few problems. The first is that our random pitch and random gain don't work. When we had set this up as a random step container, they worked well because we would play the MetaSound, it would choose a random value, the MetaSound would stop, and then when it played it again, it would choose a random value again. But since we're not stopping the MetaSound, we aren't triggering the random float nodes again. To remedy this, we need to connect something to the next inputs of the random float nodes every time the wave player retriggers. An easy thing to do is just to create a variable from the repeat out output of the trigger repeat node and plug that into our random float nodes. The other problem was that because our audio files are longer than half a second, the currently playing audio file would cut out once the new one would start. Since we're only using one wave player, only one audio file can play at the same time. We can fix this by making a copy of the random get, wave player, and sound array, and playing the two groups of them in alternation, which is also something that we'll have to do when we want to loop music that has a resonant tail. To alternate between the two groups, we can connect our repeat out variable to a node called trigger sequence, which triggers its outputs in sequence, and since we have loop tick, it will alternate between the 0 and 1 outputs for as long as the MetaSound plays. Like in Wwise, we can randomize our trigger rate. We do this by using the random time node. And like with the random pitch and random gain, we're going to need to re-trigger this node every time a sound plays. But we can't connect the repeat out to it because it causes a loop and MetaSounds don't like that. In cases like these, we need to use a delayed variable, and we can create one by holding Alt while dragging the variable from the members window into the graph. And now we're able to connect it. Because our continuous container is a looping MetaSound, we don't need the unfinished output. We could delete it from the Interfaces tab, but we could always trigger the unfinished output from a blueprint. And in case you want to do that, let's set it up in the MetaSound. We can start off by making an input to trigger the unfinished output. I'll name it Stop MetaSound, which is a universal name I use whenever I want to stop a MetaSound. And now if we play it and trigger it, our MetaSound will stop. However, if it triggers while an audio file is playing, it's going to stop abruptly. To fade out, we want to make our gain go from 1 to 0, and to do that, we can use the trigger route node, which allows us to go from one value to another. Our value 0 in the trigger route is our default value, and so if we connect it to the gain of the last mixer in our audio chain, and we set our value 1 to 0, we can connect our stop MetaSound input to our set 1 input of the trigger route to make the MetaSound go from a gain of 1 to 0 when we trigger stop MetaSound. Let's have a listen. Well, that sucked. The problem is that we're setting the gain to 0 instantaneously, but we want to do it over a period of time. We want to create the equivalent of an interpolation mode in Wwise. To do that, we'll use the interp2 node. If I set the interp time to 2 seconds, we'll have a fade out over 2 seconds. To make sure that the unfinished output only triggers once the MetaSound is faded out, we can create an input for our interp time and connect it to a trigger delay before triggering our unfinished. Sometimes I still find like the MetaSound sounds like it's cutting out a bit abruptly, so as a safety measure, I always add a short delay to the interp time before triggering the unfinished output. So after a bit of tidying up, here's how our MetaSound looks. To sum up, we're cycling between two wave players using the trigger repeat node. We are randomizing the pitch, the gain, and the trigger rate time. And if we want to stop the MetaSound, we can use our input stop MetaSound to trigger the unfinished output after the MetaSound fades out. I also created a patch out of all that. So now if I want to use a random continuous with a trigger rate in any MetaSound, all I have to do is add that patch. Hope this was helpful for you. I'll be releasing videos on the other transition types soon.